Thanks, Kit. And happy Easter, everybody. My name's Mike. I've not met you before. It's just so exciting to be together today, Easter Sunday, one of the best days of the year to be together as a church family, and great to have people with us as well who are here, who aren't normally here on other Sundays. So it's brilliant to be together. I thought I'd start by sharing with you one of the great works of fiction that I've been digging into recently. Here it is, Mr. Silly. It's a great book if you've not read it before, and if you think you're past the sort of stage of reading this sort of thing, you're definitely wrong. It's worth going back into. And I've been reading it recently, over and over again, actually. I liked it so much. And I'll try not to give too many plot spoilers, but the basic gist of it is it's centered around Mr. Silly trying to win the Nonsense Cup. And Mr. Silly's he's desperate to win the Nonsense Cup. He keeps getting beaten by other people with equally sort of ridiculous credentials, people like Mr. Ridiculous and others like that who are very good at this. And the aim of the Nonsense Cup is to produce the thing or the idea that sounds the most like nonsense to everybody, and that's the way you win. So here are a few of the sort of previous contestants, and I'm not going to spoil the ending, please don't worry. But here are some of the things that have gone up. A wallpapered house where the wallpaper is on the outside rather than the inside, which I thought was actually quite clever, but probably not good in rainy weather. Or what's the next one? A car with square wheels, not so good, but nonsense nonetheless. So good in the context of the competition. Or this one, a square apple. I think that's actually a really good idea. It's much better for storage than a fruit bowl because you make the most of the space, don't you? Or this teapot, which has obvious issues with it. That is utter nonsense. And maybe it's because I've been reading this book, but reading through the Bible passages we looked at today, there's one word in particular that stood out to me as a word which wasn't very Bible-like, sort of word I don't expect to see in the Bible, and that is the word nonsense. Did you see that in that first reading that Phoebe read for us? I'm going to dip in and out of this on page 1061, so if you want to follow along. But it was verse number 11, and the women have gone to the tomb, and they've come back to see the 11, Jesus' closest followers, and the others, it says. So there's other people there, and they tell them what they've seen, this angel saying that Jesus has risen, that he's no longer there. And verse 11, the disciples and the others, but they did not believe the women because their words to them seemed like nonsense. I thought it's not a very Bible word, but I thought it was interesting. I wonder if you today feel that Jesus rising from the grave is nonsense, sounds like nonsense. And in some ways, perhaps if you don't feel like that, perhaps we've kind of lost the wonder of it a little bit. Because what that seems to be happening here is that the disciples and the others seem to think of the idea of the empty tomb, Jesus rising from the grave, is a bit like the kind of idea of wallpaper in the outside of your house, or square apples, or teapots that pour onto themselves, not into your cup. They're saying the idea of someone coming back from the dead is so utterly ridiculous that they just cannot get their heads around it. And as the women speak these words, I trust that the words they're saying were very understandable, but it just seemed like nonsense. They couldn't get their heads around this. And perhaps you're here today and you're not a Christian. You've come along because you know it's a big day, and it's a big day for the people you're with. And to you think it does sound like nonsense. We live in a bit of a split world, don't we? Where on the one hand, we have a sense that we want there to be something more than this life. We really want there to be something more than this life. And we have all sorts of beliefs throughout civilizations, throughout history, about something beyond death. Something beyond this life. It's something about the kind of precious nature of it and our interactions between human beings and just the complexity of what we're like and our consciousness that just makes us think it can't just end. It can't just end there. There's got to carry on. There's got to be something more to it than that. And we pick that up in some of our language when we say things like, they've gone to a better place, or they're still with you, or all that sort of language we use. It's really hard for us to think that there's nothing after death, and so we have that kind of thought. But also in our culture, there's a sense, a kind of consensus among many that if you can't kind of prove it and see it and touch it, it can't be real. And so this sort of thing can't happen. That there's not enough evidence for something after this life. And I suppose if you think about this world, it's a bit like this. We're all born into a huge, enormous room. No windows, no doors, can't really see what's going on the outside. And we're all inside this room. We all go about it our own ways, don't we? Trying to work out if there's anything beyond the room. So those of you a bit more scientifically minded might kind of start tapping on walls and floors and trying to do things like that and work out, does it sound like, how thick's this wall, sound like what's beyond that? There might be others who are a bit more sort of philosophically minded and think about what are we like, our being, the sense of kind of who I am as a person. Does that tell me there must be something more? And others of us just look around at other people and try and just work out what's going on. And none of those people can know for sure. And so the conclusion very often is that although we might hope there's something beyond this life, we're just not sure there can be. But let's pick up the story here in verse 13, which is where Kit started reading for us. And two of those followers of Jesus, the kind of wider group, were off on an Easter Sunday walk. They're off to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles away from Jerusalem. So it's a pretty decent walk. And they start wandering along, and they've got plenty to talk about. All these things have happened. In the last couple of days, Jesus has been taken and betrayed. He's been crucified. And now there's this report of the empty tomb. And they're wandering along, chattering away. And an unidentified stranger comes up alongside them. And they kind of don't clock who he is. But he asks the question, what are you talking about? What are you discussing, verse 17, together as you walk along? And we see that this is a pretty unexpected question for them. They can't quite believe that someone is so disconnected from life that they can't work out what they're talking about. Because you see, they're on this long walk, 7 miles to go. And what do? They stood still. It stopped them in their tracks. They're so bemused by this question that this stranger alongside them doesn't know what's going on, that they just stop and stand still. And their faces are downcast. And one of them, Cleopas, is the guy who responds. And he says, are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days? I.e., what planet are you on? Everybody knows what's been going on. It's been kicking off. It's been all anyone's talking about. It's the big thing of the city. How can you not know what's going on? What planet are you on? And Jesus goes, what things? And kind of prompts the next question. And so he speaks. And as we see Cleopas's answer here, and the answer of the other disciple walking along, we start to see why the idea that Jesus has risen from the dead is such nonsense to them. Here's what he says. Here's what they say together. He was a prophet, Jesus of Nazareth, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. They've been following Jesus these years. They've been going along and listening to him and hearing. They've been impressed, and they think he's powerful in word and deed. He's doing all of these things. And yet, he hasn't delivered. We thought he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. We thought he was the one who was going to kind of take them out of their kind of occupation by the Romans and free them. He was going to be the one who was going to make it all good for us. It seemed so good. He did so many good things. He said so many good things, but he died. He failed. Him being crucified gave them that sense of weakness and failure that they just thought he hadn't done what he'd come to do. They'd been longing for this promised one, this Messiah who would liberate them and redeem them, but their hopes are dashed. And in that, I think we get an insight to why it was so hard for these disciples to get their head around what had happened. You saw actually in that first reading when the 2 men in gleaming clothes like lightning, sound like angels to me, as they spoke to the women, said to them, he's not here in verse 6, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was with you still in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, on the third day be raised again. Then they remembered his words. See, Jesus had said this would happen, and yet it just was so beyond their kind of idea of what he was going to be that it seems to have gone out of their minds, and they're not aware. They couldn't even bring those words to mind in the moment. Because nobody wants to follow a weak, disgraced failure, do they? That's effectively what the cross would have seemed. Weakness, disgrace, and failure. as this man they'd followed and their hope in had been growing over those years was killed on that cross. Well, with that, the seemingly ignorant stranger lets them have it. And I wonder how they felt when he's kind of gone along and said, I don't really know what you're talking about. What's going on? And then he lets them have it in verse 25. He doesn't hold back, does he? He says, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? You see, the suffering at the heart of what's been going on, these events in Jerusalem that are baffling them so much, they're what had to happen, aren't they? Because this is the nature of the Christian faith. It's topsy-turvy. It turns the world upside down. It's not what the world expects. Because the suffering at the heart of Jesus' death on the cross, no, it wasn't failure. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't disgrace. For what looks like weakness here, as Jesus dies on the cross, is what leads to those who put their trust in being able to have real strength in him, through him. What looks like failure is the eternal success of the forgiveness that he offers. And when he was disgraced, it was so that one day we might be honored. See, at that moment of suffering on the cross was when Jesus died to pay for the rebellion of all of human beings against God. In that moment as he dies, weakness, disgrace, failure, ultimately in him brings strength, honor, success. Because forgiveness comes, that people can stand before God and say, yes, I know you, and I can come to you, and I am forgiven. Thank you, because of what Jesus does. That's what turns what the world thinks upside down. And so Jesus comes to them and he says, suffering, it had to happen. It had to happen for glory to follow. And there followed probably the best Bible study anyone's ever been a part of, don't you think? Jesus carried on, Luke carries on his records, and beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he, Jesus, explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. The best Bible study ever. And who knows quite what was said as Jesus spoke to them on this road. But he told them about the one who's the center of it all, about how all of Scripture had pointed to him. It's kind of like, and it's nowhere near this, but it's kind of like going to see the latest James Bond film with Daniel Craig in the cinema, sat next to him, or eating a Victoria sponge with Mary Berry and trying to kind of just talk your way through it with them. Because the whole of history is centered around this man. The whole of history is centered around he would go and suffer and be glorified. That everything had come before would be fulfilled in him. The one who is the center of history, the one who created history, showing them what his story was all about. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine what he said? Now, maybe there was Jesus and he was telling them about how Moses led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. And he said all of that, well, that pointed forward to me. And how the blood of the lamb spread over the doorposts. Well, that sacrifice was a pointer to the sacrifice that would be made for the sins of the world. And the whole sacrificial system, well, that was all about when the one sacrifice that would be the one that was made for all time would be made. That's me on the cross. Or the temple and how that could help people come sort of into contact with God. But it was all a pointer to how we couldn't come close to him until the price was paid. And then how the curtain would rip from top to bottom. How human beings could then come to know God. How one day we would be in his presence. It was all appointed to that. How all those failed judges and kings, they were all appointed to the one true king that we really needed, the one who would never let us down, who would never fail. How the exile going out and coming back was all about how one day we, because of our exile from sin, we brought back into God's presence as his family. How Isaiah's suffering servant pointed to the one who would suffer on the cross. And I'm sure much, much more. See, Jesus' resurrection makes sense of it all. The beauty in this world, the brokenness, the grace of God over and over again. The whole arc of the redemptive stories all around us that we love and that we long for. Just a shadow of the one great story of Jesus at the center. And you and I as recipients of his grace if you trust him. Jesus' resurrection makes sense of all that we see around us in this world. As we see his authority, we see who he is. It validates everything that he says. And no wonder if that's what happened, that they urged him to stay. See, as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it's nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. I think their minds must have been racing, mustn't they? After all he said all along that road, they've gone from being downcast at the beginning of the day, totally down, and their minds must have been racing and racing and racing as they were trying to process all that he said. And at the same time as their minds racing, something was going on deep inside of them. A feeling in their gut that warned them and excited them and moved them. And as they say, "It's getting late, stay with us, stay with us." And he does. They sit down to eat. And what does he do? As is customary, he breaks the bread to start the meal. And as he does it, something strikes them. Verse 31, then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. It's him. As he broke that bread, maybe it's the way he did it. Maybe it was just God's work in opening their eyes. Maybe both at the same time. There was something, this man that they've been walking with, it's him. What a moment that must have been. And in that moment, he was gone. Can you imagine the emotional journey of these men if they've gone through on this Easter Sunday? These disciples. Now, do you imagine the emotional journey of what they've gone through, from the women coming, disbelief, nonsense, to being downcast, and this guy, he doesn't know what's going on. And they talk and they walk and 7 miles later, their minds are blown. And then they realize who he is. He's there. It's true. And then he's gone. And they turn to one another, verse 32, and I love this. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" So their hearts were burning. It's not they needed some kind of Rennie or something like that because of something they'd eaten. It was their hearts were burning because of what he'd been saying. It wasn't just their minds racing, but their hearts were warmed, their emotions were moved, their very, very inner being was alive. And we talk about heart-warming moments, don't we, when there's maybe a real moment of human kindness, or we see something, a real kind of emotional reunion, or there's just some really unlikely people who get on really well, and it's heart-warming to see it. But this isn't just heart-warming, it's heart-burning. You know those moments when you realize that God's goodness is so deep and so rich and so meaningful and makes so much sense that it just blows you away and makes you want to go, yes, yes. Because maybe for the first time they realized that Jesus' resurrection made sense of it all. And their hearts burned within them. And I hope today, on this Easter Sunday, that somehow as we reflect on that first Easter Sunday, that as we try and put ourselves in their shoes, that our hurt, our hearts burn within us too. Yes, yes. He came back. He's alive. He's risen, we say at the beginning. Because today we're celebrating how Jesus' resurrection changes everything for us, doesn't it? How it makes sense of all of human history, that great longing for something beyond this life, a greater purpose, a greater destination. But how it means that death is ultimately defeated, it's gone in its full strength. How it shows that Jesus is the King to follow into the Father's arms, whatever life looks like for you. And does your heart burn within you today as you reflect on what happened on that first Easter Sunday? Does it burn within you? How do they respond in that moment of realization? Verse 33, they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. Another 7 miles they got up. That's mad, isn't it? The end of it, they go, it's nearly dark. We've got to stop because we've got to have something end. It can't really go on any longer today. They see Jesus and they've just got to go back and tell people. Another 7 miles, that's an Easter half marathon, Easter Sunday. Imagine that. They're bursting to say something, to tell others. And I'm sure if they could, no doubt they'd have tweeted it, or they'd have put a photo of the broken bread on Instagram and said, "Guess who?" as the caption. Or that they'd have FaceTimed Peter and said, "Peter, look what's happened." Or maybe, just maybe, they'd have put on TikTok a little video of Cleopas doing a dance of delight that would have gone viral. But instead, what do? They get back on the road, 7 miles more, nearly evening, and they're on the way back. And I reckon that trip back was a personal best time for them, their best 7-mile split they've ever done. Because inside them, their hearts are burning. They know that everything's changed. They know that it's real. They know that everything Jesus ever said matters, is true, and they can bet their lives on it, and they can go to death for the very thing that they doubted that morning. Because Jesus' resurrection makes sense of everything. Can you imagine that feeling as they got there and they kept going and they got going and they burst into the room ready to tell everyone we've seen them? And do you see what happens? They're cut off, aren't they? Because everyone else goes, they go, it's true, they say to them. And they go, yeah, we know it's true. We've just seen him, it's true. And their moment's gone because they're going, it's true. He's appeared to Simon. They go, he's appeared to us. We've seen him. It's true. He's risen. It changes everything. And you wonder if they had a bit of a competition to kind of outdo one another's stories because their whole world had changed in that moment. And we scrabble around for answers, don't we, in this world? We scrabble around for answers, don't we? We're in that room knocking on the walls and thinking about what's going on outside and thinking deep into our hearts of what's going on. We scrabble around for answers, but he gives them. Because in this seemingly nonsensical moment, it makes everything make sense. Jesus bursts into the room of this world, doesn't he? And he says there is something more than this. There is something beyond what you can work out by tapping the walls. And you know what? If you don't believe me, I'm going to come back from the dead and show you that you've got to believe me, because nobody does that. He makes sense of it all. And he shows us, doesn't he, that there is a God who cares about you, who loves his broken people more than you can ever imagine. And a God with whom you can face with confidence and joy whatever it throws at you, even death. You can face it all with him. And to top it off, I'm just going beyond what Kit read for us, verse 36, but I love this, the kind of mic drop moment. Jesus appears amongst them. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them. Come on, you try to top each other with your stories. Oh, come on, we've seen him. And he goes, here I am. Peace be with you. They were startled and frightened, thinking they saw a ghost. Said to them, why are you troubled? Why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at me. Look at my hands and feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have. And then he says, when he said this, he showed his hands and feet. While he still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, and I love this. He says, do you got anything to eat? He's kind of burst into the room. There's all this going on. And Jesus turns and says, you got anything to eat? I'm starving. And they give him a bit of broiled fish. Where does the Easter story leave you today? Probably not with a half marathon under your belt, though maybe that could be a new ECC tradition starting next Easter, 14 miles before the 4:30 service. Maybe not. But hopefully it leaves you with some of that joy and amazement that meant the disciples then, they still kind of don't believe it, even when he stood amongst them. Maybe it leaves you, and I hope it does, with some of that joy and amazement. Some of that peace be with you, and a burning heart this afternoon. Because Jesus really lived, he really died, and he is risen. And his resurrection makes sense of it all. Let's praise him. Let me pray. Jesus, we praise you that you're risen. We praise you that it's true. We praise you that we know that we can have confidence and assurance. Thank you that death is defeated. Thank you that it no longer has the victory over us. Thank you for the joy and amazement that we can have. And thank you that we can walk with you every day of our lives now. We can know you and enjoy your goodness forever and ever. Amen.
There are a couple of questions. So first of all, at the start of chapter 24, it's the women who enter the tomb, see the angels. Are we to make anything of this as opposed to, for instance, the 11 being there? Why women? Why not men?
I think one of the factors that is culturally at that time, the testimony of women wasn't seen as wasn't seen as valid within a kind of legal context within that kind of culture of the time. And so I think actually this is one of the things that helps us see the authenticity of what was going on here, is that if this was all kind of made up, they'd be unlikely witnesses for someone to make up, because there wouldn't have been kind of trusted automatically in that context in a kind of wider sense. I think that's one part of it. The other thing is actually we just see there are a bunch of really faithful women who, when all the men scatter, seem to be sticking by Jesus, who are there at the crucifixion, who are the kind of last ones watching him there, who are the first here to kind of anoint the body. And so in some sense it makes sense that they're the ones who see him first. And actually that should help us see how important these the female followers of Jesus are within the kind of gospel narrative, that they're right in the thick of things all the way through. And here they are the first witnesses. They're the ones who haven't seemed to have kind of gone and locked themselves up in a room, but are actually going to try and do something useful here. And maybe that does play into how the men responded to their testimony. But I think probably largely that's around how ridiculous it seemed that someone had come back from the dead.
And somebody asked, can you please remind us of some Old Testament prophecies of the resurrection?
That's a good question. And remind seems to suggest that I've maybe given a list of these before, which I've never done in my life. So I think one of the interesting things is we saw last week actually in 1 Corinthians 15, if you were here last week, Paul writes that Jesus was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. So he says, and we can see that they're in there in the Old Testament, but they don't seem to be as easy and clear to find as we'd like. We'd quite like it, a verse somewhere in one of the minor prophets saying, and by the way, the Messiah will appear out of his tomb, on the third day. And it never is quite said that clearly. But I think there are kind of hints as you piece things together. And to be perfectly honest, when I saw this question was in here, I thought I can only really think of one off the top of my head. So I Googled it during the last song. So I'd suggest that if you're really interested, that's the place to go. Here's the one which I think is clearest. Isaiah 53, verse 10 and 11. It was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring prolong his days. Verse 11 is the key one here. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. And this is all within the context of seemingly one of the clearest prophecies of the Messiah going to die on the cross, bearing the iniquities and the sin of the world. And that seems to be one of the clearest ones. I think you can piece it together. Resurrection is a theme in the Old Testament that you can see. But these explicit things, we're told they're there, but actually they're quite hard to find. So I think that's how to respond. The other thing to say is that when Jesus responds to the disciples here on the road, the thing he seems to pick them up on is how slow you were to believe that the Messiah would suffer and then be glorified. And so actually it seemed that even though the resurrection is shocking, actually they seem to have lost hope at the crucifixion, because their idea of Messiah wasn't one who turned the world upside down by dying for sin. And yet that was all about what Jesus came for, to seek and to save the lost. So actually that seems to be the crux of where he says to them, how slow and foolish you've been. And we can kind of see that a bit more clearly, I think, throughout the Old Testament.
Psalm 16 would be another great place to go. Psalm 16, verse 10, my funeral psalm. Just in case any of you are there, you'll hear it read. It's a beautiful bit talking about the resurrection of the dead. Psalm 16, verse 10 as well. Brilliant.
That came up on Google.
You Googled that?
Well, it came up.
You mean you just didn't know that?
Yeah.
Whew. Right, thank you, Mike.